There are shows with psychics.
And there are shows with doctors.
But there's no show like The Psychic and the Doc.
Your practical paranormal power unleashed.
This show synthesizes the talents of world-class medium Mark Anthony, the psychic lawyer, psychic explorer,
and street smart spiritualist, behavioral psychologist, Dr. Pat Baccili. All subjects are on the table and no topic is taboo. Inspiration, insight,
action, and fun as Mark Anthony connects callers with loved ones in spirit.
In tandem with Dr. Pat's fresh, no-nonsense, street smart, intuitive insights. And she is hilarious.
Extraordinary problems
require extraordinary solutions, which may come from this side
or the other side. This is The Psychic
and the Doc, and it starts now. Everyone, to the Transformation Network show, The Psychic and the Doc. I'm the Psychic, and I'm here with my amazing co-host, Dr. Pat Baccili. She's the Doc. And our guest today is Brian Smith. This show is for anyone coping with the loss of a loved one. Brian is truly a Renaissance man. He is an author, podcast host, life coach, grief recovery expert, and an amazingly inspirational person. Brian became very acquainted with grief in 2015 after the sudden and tragic passing of his beloved 15-year-old daughter, Shayna. Brian knew that he had to survive grief for the sake of his wife and his other daughter, but he began a lifelong journey, and he studied the nature of life and death and how to progress through grief. And this has led Brian to an amazing journey to helping parents heal from the passing of a child. He founded the organization Grief to Growth, and his healing work touches people worldwide. On behalf of Dr. Pat, myself, and the Transformation Network, we're welcoming and honored to have you on our show today, Brian Smith.
Hi, Brian.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, Brian, we've had the pleasure of getting to know each other at our work and in helping parents heal. And I want to ask first, you talk about being a life coach. And I know Dr. Pat does a lot of life coaching. How do you define what a life coach is, and what is your role as a life coach?
Yeah, that's a great question, because frankly, before I started doing life coaching, I had some really big misconceptions about it. The way I work with people is basically, I think the answers that we need are within us, but sometimes we need help bringing them out. We need help kind of getting our bearings again. We go through life kind of lost. So what a life coach does, or what I try to do, is I consider myself to be a navigator. So you tell me where you want to go, and I'll help you kind of get there and help you to figure out what your true beliefs are, what your true values are, and to go within to find the answers that you need. So I think of it as, sometimes I call it like I'm like a professional dad. I'm an older guy. I've been around a long time. I have a couple daughters, so I kind of guide people the way like a dad would.
That's really cool. And speaking of being a dad, I met your wife and your beautiful daughter when we were at, I believe it was Helping Parents Heal a couple years back. And unfortunately, you have earned the status of being what is known as a shining light parent. Can you explain what the term shining light parent means?
Yeah, a shining light parent is actually, I think it was coined by Suzanne Giesemann, who's a part of our organization as well. She has a daughter in spirit. And what a shining light parent is a parent who has a child on the other side, and it has a dual meaning. So our children on the other side, we consider to be shining lights. They are inspiration. We believe they're our partners. We believe that they're still with us. They guide us. They inspire us. But we aspire to become shining light parents. When we started, well, I didn't start the organization, but when I joined Helping Parents Heal, we use the term bereaved parents, which is an activating term for a lot of us, for most of us actually. We don't like that term because it implies that for the rest of your life, you're going to be in a state of bereavement. And we don't believe that's actually necessary. We aspire to become shining lights ourselves. We aspire to inspire other people.
Wow.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Brian, and thank you so much for joining us here today. I don't know if you've heard our show as often as I think we do our show, but I will just tell you that the hardest part, I think, for both Mark and I are when we get a caller in whose child has passed. And Mark, I know, has been doing this a really long time. This is new for me to have that experience up close and personal. And we always say during that show is that the hardest thing we could imagine, which is the timing of events, we don't believe that a parent should watch a child pass. And we always say that, and yet here we are. And I wanted to ask you about that because it's unimaginable at some level, isn't it? I mean, you run your life and you think about, well, wait a minute, I got to plan for my own afterlife. You know, I'm watching myself and I'm thinking, oh, I got to get myself, okay, I'm just like closer to the afterlife than I've ever been right now. And you prepare yourself, but you don't prepare yourself necessarily for a child. How did your preparation help you prepare for something that is so unimaginable?
Well, that's a great question. Let me see if I can answer it succinctly. Um, my life prepared me for this. I was raised as a fundamentalist Christian in what I call a toxic religious environment. I had an extreme fear of death from the time I was about 5 years old. So from the time I was 5 to the time I was about 35, I was struggling with that. And so what I did was I started to study the afterlife. And the more I learned about it, the less I feared it. So by the time Shayna passed away, I was confident that we go on. I knew it scientifically, philosophically, by other religions, etc. But when Shayna passed, of course, I was not prepared for that. And I'll never forget, I called my father. We were on the way to the hospital, and Shayna was in the ambulance, and I was riding in the police car taking her body to the hospital at the time. And he said, "There's nothing like losing a child. You're never the same after that." His mother lost 2 children. What I've realized since then is this belief that we have that we're supposed to live X number of years and a parent's going to survive a child is a myth. It's one of those myths we tell ourselves to feel like we're in control. The fact is, children precede their parents in death all the time. If you get to be my age, the odds are somewhere between 15 and 20% that you will have lost a child.
Mm.
So it's something we tell ourselves again to make ourselves feel good about life and not to worry. We shouldn't have to worry about our children preceding us. And just to wrap up, I don't view it as a tragedy anymore. We all have a life plan. We all have a life purpose. Some of us plan to be here for a long time. Some of us plan to be here for a short time. I think Shayna decided to come in and spend just the best part of life, which is being a child, and said, "I'm out of here."
Yeah, I know. Thank you for answering that. And you know, this is a full hour show, so we love when you just talk and talk stories. So please feel free to go ahead.
Okay, sure.
I'm not going to get to the guitar on your back wall. I'm sure that Mark will get to that. But I want to thank you for sharing that. Because it's so hard sometimes when you do a show, right, Mark, like the psychic and the doc, it's hard for us to find words. And so through your words, through your vision, through the work that you do, it allows us and helps us to be able to transfer that to people and also to send them to you. Because in the world we live in today, we have to be able to provide solutions. That's what this network's about. It wasn't born out of some lofty dream to make money. It was born out of the idea of a childhood like mine, you know, Mark. You know, we come from places, pretty much you and I could have been two peas in a pod. But how do we rise up, right, Mark? Isn't that what we're talking about today?
It really is. And, you know, Brian, Dr. Pat and I, we field so many calls from parents, from Shining Light parents. And it's one of the reasons we really wanted to have you on the show
Yeah.
is because you're an inspiration to other parents who've lost children, and you are very evolved in how you're approaching grief. I especially like the way you say you don't have to be bereaved for your entire life. And that's very important because a lot of people they just get stuck in that tar pit of depression. And I'm not faulting anyone for doing that. I mean, you know better than anybody how crushing that is. But what you teach, and with your organization, Grief to Growth, you're teaching people how to get out of that funk and gunk.
Yeah, if you choose to, as you said, I believe it's a choice. And remember, after Shayna passed, it was just a few weeks after she passed, we went to a meeting with an organization for people who had lost children. And there was a mother there. It had been 10 years since her daughter had passed, and she was miserable. She was angry. She was bitter. It was like it just happened the day before. At that point, I had actually decided in my mind that's what I was going to be miserable for the rest of my life. That was the way I was going to honor my daughter, was by showing how much I loved her by being miserable. But that woman taught me a valuable lesson. I knew I didn't want to be that person. It wasn't fair to the people around me. It wasn't fair to Shayna. I knew Shayna wouldn't want that. So that's when I realized it's a choice, and you can choose to do it either way. That was a choice I made, but I changed my mind. I decided I need to find a way to move forward, and I made that effort.
Mm. Yeah. Well, look, let's take a short break. When we come back, there's so much to talk with you about, right, Mark? So
Oh,
much. Can't
yeah.
wait to talk about the gyms. That's like been on my list to do. But when we come back, we're going to be talking about what does this mean? What is it like? And how do you take grief? Let's just call it that for a moment. How do you take grief and your own grief personally and cultivate it, plant that seed, let it grow, have it turn into something of enormous service for so many people? How does one do that? Well, that's a conversation that Mark, and myself, and Brian are going to have because that's exactly what you did, Brian. Before we go to break, how do people find out more about you? Can you give us your website? Also, you have a free download there. Tell us about that.
Yeah, you mentioned GEMS, and I do have a free download there. It's called GEMS, GEMS, and we'll talk about what that stands for. My website is growth.com. So it's grief numeral 2 growth.com. You can find out everything about me there.
And let me give you a quote before you go to break from Brian. Y'all write this down. You don't get it. We'll say it when we come back. Self-care is a priority and necessity, not a luxury. Boy, did I take that in this morning, folks. Let's take a short break. We'll be right back.
The Transformation Network. This is the Psychic and the Doc, and we have a very special guest today, Brian Smith, who is the head of Grief to Growth. That's GRIEF, the number 2, and then growth, GROWTH.com. And we're talking about a very, very sensitive subject, which is coping with the loss of a loved one, in particular, losing a child. Brian, as an expert in the field of grief recovery, death is that's the proverbial pink elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. It is such an uncomfortable story, and I know Dr. Pat has had to deal with very serious losses in her life. I have, and of course, you losing your daughter is just so crushing. How do you destigmatize? How do you begin the process to talk about death?
Well, first of all, I very rarely use the word death. And it's kind of funny. I was thinking after Shayna first passed, I was dealing with a grief counselor. And she said, well, when people use all these euphemisms, I realize they haven't accepted the fact that their loved one is dead. We just need to use the word dead.
Right.
The reason I don't like the word death, because death is a cessation of life. And while our bodies physically die, we don't truly die. This comes from Mark, all the work that you've done, people that have had near-death experiences. In fact, some people have had near-death experiences say there's not even a loss of consciousness. It's just like you're here and then you're there. So what I try to do with people is reframing. What is death? What does that really mean? Yes, your loved ones, physically, their body is gone. It doesn't mean that they are gone. It doesn't mean that they cease to exist. So I'll use the word death when I'm talking to someone. I don't feel like going through a long explanation of what I really mean when I say transition or passed on. One word I heard one time was risen. They called people on the other side, he called them risen. And I love that because I want people to start using better language. And the word death is just not a great word.
I couldn't agree more with that. And as a medium, I'm always connecting people with their loved ones in spirit. because as all three of us know, and you said it perfectly, there is no death. The body may stop functioning. You know, Dr. Gary Schwartz, his wife Rhonda, she's also a medium, and she said something that I just absolutely agree with. We have one life, and it's eternal.
Yeah.
And I love that because we go, you know, we're a pure energetic being. We come into this incarnation, then we leave, and then we continue onwards. And Dr. Pat, I'd like to get your take on reframing the terminology away
Oh,
from,
sure.
yeah, what's your take on that?
Okay, death. You know what death stands for? Doing everything in afterlife towards happiness. That's what death is. DEATH. Doing everything in afterlife towards happiness. Because, you know, there's this idea, we hear it over and over again. I grew up with a mom, you know, our religious backgrounds are quite similar. Except, you know, for me, I had two of them, the Baptist way and then the Catholic way. And that was, you should have been around dinner at Sunday. But what I love about having this conversation is death is final. When the way we use that term in our society, I'm just talking about us. I'm not talking about other people in other countries because they would do, but it's the grand finale. It's like for some people, it's like, yep, been here, done that. Now I'm not. And we've learned too much to really hold that. You know, if we're going to put a stake in the sand someday, it shouldn't be this one. You know, it is the conversation that we're having where we have so much evidence of the energetic nature of who we are that we have to create a new narrative. And I love that you don't use the word death. I don't think we use it in the show at all either.
No.
But it is a global phenomenon here. We all know that. You know, yeah, I'm gonna die. So I'm 18. I'm gonna go pick my plot out in the cemetery next to my. But this is a different level of consciousness. It still doesn't, whatever we call it, though, I want to ask you both this question. Whatever you call it, it still rings the term grief loud and clear. And a lot of times, loud and clear without any alternative, without any option, you know, without anything that goes on. In my family, you knew how long grandma was grieving because she wore black and black shoes. And when she decided to change the color of what she wore, we knew she was over it.
Right.
And, you know, there are things like that. But in the world we live in today, and we've had so many losses here, you know, the world we live in today, what can we help people understand about the grieving process, about the process, so they can get their light back here? That's my question, Brian. You know, what have
Yeah.
you learned that you now teach to help people get that light back?
Well, that's a great question. And to think about our understanding that our loved ones go on, that we're going to see them again, and all the stuff that we are eternal, and all the things I could talk about for hours, it doesn't mean that we don't grieve. It doesn't.
Right.
And so I've actually dealt with people who are Christians who say, well, because I believe that my loved one is with Jesus now, I'm not supposed to grieve. And that creates a whole nother set of problems. So we are human beings. We are we have this dual nature. We are physical, we are biological, I consider my body an avatar, but we connect with each other through these avatars. So it's okay to grieve is what I want to tell people. It's okay to feel that loss, to feel that longing, to feel that love. And I always will. And I've heard someone describe grief as love with no place to go, which is kind of true, even though we do have some place to lose our love. And that's how we can deal with our grief and process it. But people will ask me, will I ever get over my grief? And I love what one of my clients said. She said, I love my grief. My grief is now a companion. I will always have the grief as long as I love her fiance had passed. As long as I love my fiance, my grief will walk with me. But I've learned to honor it. I've learned to let it be a companion. It helps me grow. And so we learn to embrace our grief. It doesn't mean that we have to be angry for the rest of our lives or sad for the rest of our lives. But yeah, there's going to be that longing. I will always long for my daughter in her physical form until the day when I open my eyes on the other side and I see her again.
I think that's an interesting point that you brought up is that grief is a road that we're all shoved down at some point in our life. I mean, nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to engage in grief. But you brought up a fascinating point about her physical presence. And what I've found is that what we're grieving is the physical presence of the person. And those of us who work with the afterlife and afterlife communication, which all three of us do, we understand that the who and what we are. I refer to it as the electromagnetic soul, which is pure energy. That's our personality continues on after physical death. But what we miss is the person, the physical person. And I remember one time I was doing a reading in person for this woman and her daughter, and the woman's husband had died, and I was talking, and she started getting very angry, and she said, he's dead. I go, no, he's actually, his energy's right next to you. And she flipped out. No, he's not. And she threw this whole thing, and it's like, well, then why did you come to me? And the thing is, I'd given such detailed evidence, his name, what he looked like, I mean, all the stuff that I couldn't know. And what it was, she was so angry at his physical passing. And then she had to take it out on somebody. And unfortunately, I was the one she was taking it out on that day. How do you get people to deal with that level of anger, Brian? And also want to throw this part in. You just launched a course entitled Love Never Dies. And I'm sure you're dealing with curbing anger in Love Never Dies.
Yeah, the anger is an interesting response. And sometimes people, because they don't have the physical presence, will actually go so far as to say, okay, well, therefore they don't exist anymore. And because they've got to hold on to that anger. They've got to have something. And that can be a coping mechanism for some people for a while, to say that they're completely gone, they don't exist anymore. So what I try to do with people is very much like what you do, Mark. And I've seen you present several times. You're a very rational, scientific person. So I present them with the evidence. Okay, this is what near-death experiences tell us. This is what mediumship tells us. This is what after-death communications tells us. This is what all these things tell us, that person is still with us, and we can continue that connection if we choose to. And for some people, they decide, no, it's too painful. I have had clients that say, I'm going to put everything away. No pictures of them. I don't want any memories from them because it's too painful for me. And I just wrapped this up. I love what Joe Biden said. He said, the thing is, we can get to the point where when their memory brings a smile to your lips before it brings a tear to your eye, that's when you've made some sort of recovery or something to that effect. And I love that, because it doesn't mean it doesn't bring a tear to our eye, but we remember them and we remember the good times before we go into that pain. And that's where I try to help people get to.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. I know we're coming up on another break, but when we get back, I want to talk about the dynamics within a family of grief and healing. Like fathers grieve in one way, mothers grieve in another, but then you grieve as a couple, but then you have another daughter. And there's a whole dynamic there as to how a sibling grieves, because we've seen this a lot at Helping Parents Heal and other grief organizations. The focus tends to be on the parents, but what about the surviving children? So we're going to go to break, and then we come back. We're going to have more with Brian Smith of Grief to Growth, and of course, my illustrious co-host, Dr. Pat Baccili. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to The Psychic and the Doc. I'm Mark Anthony, the Psychic. I'm here with my amazing co-host, Dr. Pat Baccili, world-renowned behavioral psychologist.
They used to call me Pat the Bat because I played like super softball. Just saying right there, just mega softball player. I was the hitter. Linda was the mega no arc super pitcher. Well, thank you for bringing back that childhood memory. Boom.
Ooh, that's the whole thing about being a medium. Things will come out sometimes that you're like, uh-oh, what's that all about? And we have a great guest in this episode, Brian Smith, who's an author, podcast host, a life coach, and a shining light parent. And we're talking about the loss of a loved one and grief recovery. And as in my work as a medium, and Dr. Pat definitely sees this in her work as a behavioral psychologist, grief is very complex. You have the way the mother grieves, the way the father grieves, and the way they grieve as parents. And then if there are surviving children, which you have your daughter Kayla here in this world, and she's awesome. I had dinner with Brian, his wife, and Kayla, who should be a supermodel. I mean, let me tell you, she's just beautiful inside and out.
Mm.
And when I was talking to her, obviously losing her sister was crushing and devastating. Brian, how do you counsel? How do you work with the surviving siblings? I mean, you know from firsthand experience, and because there's a lot of people out here who have lost siblings, they don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah, great question. I'll tell you about my experience, and then I'll tell you about how I work with clients. I was very fortunate, even though I had studied the afterlife like crazy before Shayna passed. And I was always picture me, we're laying in bed, and I'm reading afterlife books, Gary Schwartz, all that kind of stuff. My wife's reading novels. She had no interest in any of this stuff. And we went to church, and we were, we did that stuff. But we didn't really talk that much about the afterlife. So when Shayna passed, I dove in, even deeper into what I was studying. My wife, thankfully, came along with me. So she started reading the same books that I read. We went to Helping Parents Heal together. Kayla was a real concern. Kayla was 18 years old when Shayna passed. And Kayla and Shayna were like twins, even though they were 3 years apart. Kayla was like mother/twin sister to Shayna. And I had real concerns about Kayla because she had told me a few years before that she was an atheist and a materialist, I should say. And so I'm thinking, okay, I don't know how she's gonna deal with this. Kayla, as you said, Mark, is amazing. She's actually super intuitive. She's still very close to Shayna. So we've been very fortunate. Now, I have dealt with families where they're not so fortunate, where the mother and the father will grieve differently and go their own ways. And there's a myth, and I remember a friend telling me after Shayna died, she's like, "Well, it's a shame because like 85% of people who lose a child end up getting divorced." That's a myth based on something that was written in a book in the 1960s. So I want to let everybody know that's not true. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get divorced because you lose a child. But if you do grieve differently and go in different directions and don't honor the way the other person grieves, saying, well, they don't really care because they don't want to look at pictures anymore, for example, or whatever it is. So it's really important to honor the way the other person grieves. When it comes to siblings, children grieve differently than adults. We have to understand it. They're not going to process things the way that we do. So the best thing I tell people is you want to set an example for them. You want to show them that it's okay to grieve, it's okay to mourn, it's okay to cry, it's okay to be angry. Give them permission, give them space, but also understand they're not going to express it the way that you do, and they need to find whatever their outlets are.
That's a really positive and healthy approach, and particularly when children are younger. And I see this a lot. You have to find out, what does the children know? What does the child know? What does the child understand? I've heard a lot of people say that, well, my child is so angry because they're tired of hearing that, their sister or their daddy is in heaven. They get tired of hearing, well, when are they coming back from heaven? Dr. Pat, you were one of those children.
Yeah, I was.
You were one of those children. How did you learn to cope with that and deal with this?
It's a great question. And I wish I would have known Brian. I mean, that certainly would have made the pathway a lot easier. But, for me, I had back-to-back deaths. I had my spiritual mentor, then I had my mom, then I had my sister. And my mom and my sister's passing were, I think, a year maybe apart. And I don't know. I mean, we say the term unexpected. I've heard that over and over again during my sister's transition. Unexpected, unexpected. And I didn't know what to make of that because it didn't feel like, I mean, who cares? It's like unexpected as opposed to expected. I don't think it diminishes any of that.
Hmm.
But there wasn't really, for those of us, there wasn't really much that I could get my hands on at the time. And learning about the grief process and allowing oneself to feel, I think was my greatest journey. Because I grew up really not wanting to feel anything.
Mm.
I mean, I grew up in a childhood, you know, I don't want to go into that story, but I grew up in the projects. Mom commits suicide at age 6, homeless at 17. So I'm just telling you, by the time I'm 17, by the time I turned 18, I made a commitment to myself to never feel anything again, right? But you can't anticipate what it feels like to lose a sister. You know what I mean? It's hard for me to explain. But you know, today, Brian, you being on the show, what we're doing is we're providing all the people, Mark, that call into our show. We're providing them with a solution. We're providing them with you, Brian, and you're sharing your strength, your experience, and your hope. And for so many of us, what we did was either drink or use. That's what we did.
Mm-hmm.
Spent half of our lives drinking and using because that was our solution to grief, by the way.
It was
It's not really, but I'm
it
just
isn't.
saying.
It isn't, because those are forms of avoidance and
Exactly.
denial. And Brian, you were talking about the person who was taking all the pictures away because they don't want to see it. And
Right.
the joke in psychological circles are, denial is not just a river in Africa anymore. People get into deny. You can't deny grief. That's what I see. In my book, Evidence of Eternity, I talk about grief, crime, grief, how people try to suppress, deny, and avoid coping with grief. It's particularly when the person grieving is a child or young adult, and then it surfaces, like Dr. Pat saying about using, abusing, and those behaviors lead then to that person inflicting grief on someone else. Case in point, a drunk driver. Most people that are drunk drivers, I'd say all the ones I represented and prosecuted, never woke up one day and saying, I think I'll go get wasted today and go kill somebody. But why did they get wasted? Why are they using and abusing? And I found that more often than not, at the root of it was an unresolved grief. And that's why what you're doing, Brian, is so important. Because when Dr. Pat was a child, was there anything like the psychic and the doc? Was there anything like grief to growth? That's the advantage people have now is an organization like Grief to Growth is here for you. Brian, tell us more about Grief to Growth.
Well, I started Grief to Growth 3, 4, 5 years ago, I guess. It just kind of evolved out of my work with helping parents heal. I was dealing with hundreds or thousands of parents through some of the online groups that we were doing. And I realized that I had developed this expertise over the course of my life. I think our lives are set up this way. So my life was set up this way anyway. And Shayna, who, for people that are watching, Shayna is behind me. Her picture is behind me, and that's not just that's more than just symbolic. Shayna is literally behind me. Shayna is a big driver for this. So what I do with people is I, again, try to help them reframe. I try to teach people in a condensed way what it took me decades to figure out in a few weeks or a few months to say, everything's okay. Our loved one's still with us. We have continuing bonds. And it's not just woo woo. It's not just wishful thinking. It's not like, here's this book, believe whatever it tells you. It's evidence based. So I do that with people. I walk them through that. And I've also developed a course. We kind of briefly mentioned it, called Love Never Dies. That's the short version. It's called Love Never Dies and Neither Do You, because it really comes down to the fact that we don't die. And what I've done is I've taken most of what I've learned and put this in the online modules that you can go through with videos and do exercises to help people really understand this concept, to internalize it. Sometimes we might know it intellectually, but our hearts don't really believe it. So to get our hearts and our heads in the same place, to say, yes, my loved one is still with me. So that's kind of in a nutshell what I do with people. It's like, let's figure out what your core values are. What are your limiting beliefs? What do you believe about the afterlife? Why do you believe it? Because sometimes we don't question that. It's like we either have this very materialistic view, they're just gone, or we've got this religious view with maybe they're in hell. So neither one of these things are helpful. So what's helpful and what's true. So helping people walk through that process.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up, Brian, because when my mom passed, her suicide, my first mom, not my second mom, my first mom, I had two great moms. I mean, how does it get any better than that? But when
Mhm.
she passed, you know, being of the Catholic religion, right? A lot of this was kept in secret. However, a lot of it couldn't be kept in secret because of her multiple attempts. And to grow up with that notion and to come from that religious body where, as a child, you know, you're infused with this mommy's never going to go to heaven, you know, right? And if this
Mhm.
is all you know, then what you have now is the grief you have for the loved one you lost. Now, what you have is what I call compound grief. I don't even know if
Exactly.
it's a thing, but this is I don't know how to describe it, but it's
Mhm.
compounded, and
It
it gets
is.
compounded every day because sometimes we bring in guilt, we bring in shame, right?
Yes.
And isn't that part of what you and Mark, I believe both of y'all talk about that in the show, because you talk about, you know, what I call the exponential effect of grief. It's
Yeah.
one thing when we talk about, I've lost my child, I've lost my sister, I've lost, you know, I've lost my mom. And then that's one thing, but exponentially, people pile things on. And
Yeah.
can you talk to that? Because yes, I know that they may mean well, but it's not really helpful to walk up to the dad and say, you know, she ain't never going to heaven, honey. And then you're the child hearing that. So there are things that we compound in society. And I don't know if it's gotten any better with social media. So I know that's a long winded kind of question, but it's the world we live in today.
Yeah, in fact, one of the things that propelled me forward on my journey was my uncle. I was in my mid-20s, I believe. My uncle, who was gay, was murdered. And I remember talking to my brother, who had converted to Catholicism at the time, and he said something like the effect of, "Isn't it a shame that our uncle was in hell because he wasn't part of the church?" So what I would tell people is like, hey, when your church is teaching you things that are harmful, that just go against your soul, because from the time I was a child, the idea of hell never made any sense to me. But at that moment, that comment, that offhand comment about my uncle being in hell, being eternally tormented, one of the best people I've ever known in my life, because he was murdered. And the ironic thing is, I believe he was getting ready to maybe try to get into a church that would accept him because a church wouldn't accept you then. I was like, okay, I can't do this. I can't deal with this anymore. Is this true? So I started doing some studying, and I actually found a book by a guy, and the book was called "What God Really Says About Homosexuality." And if you read this book and you read the Bible, I believe in the right light. I think the Bible is neutral on homosexuality at best. It doesn't really talk about homosexuality the way that we know it today. And I could go in a whole different thing about that. But understand when people tell you something, question it. Is this true? Does this make sense? Why? What kind of a loving being would do this? Someone who takes their own life. They do that because they're in pain.
Yeah.
They do that because they can't handle the pain of this world. They just want it to stop. They're not a sinner. They're not a bad person. They're not a weak person. They're just someone just wants the pain to stop. So what kind of a loving God would then not only keep that person out of heaven, but torment that person? That's what I was taught. And I get a little passionate about this because,
Go for
as
it.
you said, Dr. Pat, that just compounds it for the person. Not only is your loved one gone, but they're being tormented,
Yeah.
and you're never going to see them again.
Yeah.
That's a terrible thing to say to anybody.
Yeah. And you know, part of this though is in the work you do, right, Mark? Let's talk about this for a minute. In the work you do, what you do is you build a bridge. This is what I'm calling it. I see this as the bridge you build. And it's the bridge you build from grief to gems. It's a bridge. And I call it a bridge because sometimes in this journey, at least for me, you know, I didn't see a bridge. I didn't see a way to get from
Mhm.
where I was, except by continuing to harm myself and the people around me. But then what you've created is you've created a bridge for people to say you can take one step and put it in front of the other, and there's a way. There's a way to get your life back. There's a way to be whole. And at the same time, you know, battle this next stigma that I'm going to throw at you. And it's okay for you to be happy. See, that stigma, I don't know what number that is on the scale, but it's the stigma of you should not be happy.
Mhm.
You are selfish. Oh, how selfish are you? What? You going on vacation? Your loved one just died a year ago. I mean, you see these things, but what you've created, Brian, is you've created a way for people to find a pathway to get back to their true nature, right?
Yeah, yeah. And what you just said, that thing about being happy, I thought, okay, well, if I'm really want to honor my daughter, I'll never be happy again. That would be a great way to honor her. One of my ancestors is Thomas Jefferson, and I heard it reported that when his wife died, he committed, I'm never going to be happy again. And I thought, okay, that's a good legacy to have. I want people to say that about me, because we feel like there's just survivor's guilt is a very real thing, and sometimes people feel guilty. And I heard a mother say, I can't enjoy the sunshine because my son's not here to enjoy the sunshine. But your son's enjoying a lot more than the sunshine. So I try to release people from that. Don't we grieve for two reasons. We grieve the person that we lost, and we grieve for ourselves, what we lost. Because we think, okay, well, my daughter's never going to drive. My daughter's never going to get married. All those things are never going to do. When we cross back over the other side, we get to do great things. So I want to take that away right away. Don't worry about your loved one. They're okay. They're fine. They're better than fine. Let's take care of ourselves. And that goes back to the gems, because grief it's a process. It's work. As Mark said, it will not be denied. I
Yeah.
find lean into it, embrace it, and then do the work. And what I try to do is, in my gems guide, is take and simplify that down to, like, here are 4 things you can literally start doing today that in 30 to 60 days, I think you'll start to see some benefit from. And they're very, very simple things. One is gratitude, which I always smile every time I say that, because when people first told me that and I was in grief, I'm like, what do I have to be grateful for? So we start with small things like, are you warm? Are you fed? Are you safe? We see what's going on around the world right now. Are there bombs falling in your head? We can always find something to be grateful for. And then I exercise. For me, it's walking. I walk 6 miles every morning before I start work. It could be whatever works for you. There's mindfulness and there's meditation, because it helps us to lock in all the things we're talking about. And then the last thing is sleep. Sleep can be a real problem when we're in grief,
Oh,
either
yeah.
too much or too little.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do I develop good sleep habits? And I tell people some very simple things, but try going to bed at the same time every night, making sure your bedroom is comfortable, turn off the screens, all those types of things, those sleep maintenance things. So these are things that are really, really easy that you can start doing right now. And you should do whether you're in grief or not, by the way, because as I mentioned earlier, self-care, we were taught when I was a kid, joy is Jesus, others, and you. Jesus first, then others, you're last. So that's the way to be a good Christian. It's not true. You have to take care of yourself first. You have to put your own oxygen mask on first. You're never any good to anybody else unless you're able to show up. And took me a long, long time to figure this out. So those 4 things I talk about, those are a priority for me. I do gratitude practice before I get out of bed every morning. So exercise is my first thing. I meditate twice a day, and I really work on my sleep habits, because I need to do that so I can show up and do this.
Yeah. I love that you lead with gratitude. And it is so absolutely, it's hard to explain the power of it. I call it the great annihilator. I call gratitude the great annihilator. And people say, what? I said, yeah, it's the great annihilator of negativity. It really is. And what we're talking about in what you do is you just don't tell people about it, you show them how to get there. Thank you for bringing to the forefront the fact that, yes, a lot of us have been, I don't know, conditioned or grown up or trained, let's call it training, to not put ourselves first. And then we hear the airplane announcement. Put your mask on first. What? No, I got my little baby over here. No, the baby cannot do anything with the seatbelt. You got to put your mask. And even that is so hard for people to understand. But if we can understand the power of what you've just said, especially with gratitude, because I tried to prove this, right, Mark? We talk about this a lot.
We do, and that is such a good analogy with the put the mask on first, because I always think about that, but yeah, you've got to take care of you before you can save the people next to you. And it's the same thing in grief. Man, I hear a lot of people, a friend of mine who's a judge, when his mother died, he said, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to deal with it. I have to be strong for my children.
Mm,
And wow, talk about suppressing your feelings. And Brian, this is something that I teach a lot is with men, they need to learn to cry. What are your thoughts about that?
absolutely, 100%. Crying is so important. Crying releases those emotions that we're talking about, that grief that won't be denied. There's something chemical in the tears of grief that is actually
Yes.
even different. You're releasing these things from your body. And if you think about it, every time you've ever cried, did you feel better afterwards?
Yes.
So, and I've worked with so many clients that like we'll be doing a session and they'll apologize for crying. And I'm like, don't, I love to see people cry because I know that means they're healing. I know that means they're releasing. And I was working with a couple, and it kind of goes back to the spiritual bypass, and it goes back to the religious thing. And they had lost, I don't want to identify them, but they had lost someone very close to them, a teenager, who had been shot. And the guy was like, okay, the Bible says, and the Bible says, and so I'm going to be strong. And every time his wife would try to bring any real emotion out of him, he just turned to that, which was actually making her angry because she's like, he's not being real, he's not being genuine. She was mad at God, she was cussing at God, and God can take that. That's okay. It's okay because that's release of those emotions. So I think that's really important to let those emotions out and stop judging our
Yeah,
emotions and stop saying, I don't want to cry. I want to be
yeah,
strong.
yeah.
Jesus is one of my examples. I don't identify as a Christian anymore, but I love Jesus. And one of my favorite verses in the Bible is Jesus wept.
Yes.
Short, sweet, to the point. And I'm like, if Jesus can cry, knowing who he is, knowing where he came from, knowing where he was going, knowing that it was going to be okay, even knowing he was going to raise Lazarus, Jesus still wept. So if Jesus cried, then why shouldn't I?
Mm.
And,
I gotta,
go ahead, Dr. Pat.
I gotta tell you real quick. I happened to stumble upon a group back when my mama died, and my mama and my sister, early 90s. And I happened to come across a group, and I didn't know how I got in the group. To be honest with you, Brian, I didn't remember much of anything. But I remember getting in this small group of people, and I didn't know what was to come. But I found out later the facilitator was very clear that all of us needed to cry. So, what do you think the song was that you walk in? They tell you to shut your eyes. And what do you think the song was they played? Now, take yourself back to 1991. I dare anybody that's been, try not to cry to Sinead O'Connor's Nothing Compares to You.
Mhm.
Try
Yeah.
not to cry to that. I mean, there are a million other songs, but you're right about it. I remember sitting there and I just bawled my eyes out.
Mhm.
That's how we started the next 3 hours. And so we don't think we can recover. Let's talk about this. We don't think we can recover from crying as if we have to recover from crying.
Yeah, I've
We,
heard people say, I don't want to start crying because I'll never stop.
That's it.
And I'm like, first of all, you will. Believe it or not, you will. No one's ever cried forever. Just go ahead and start. Just go ahead and try it. You that crying, I try to get people to figure out or to realize that's a good thing. And I heard someone say, I wish I could remember what it was. A medium is saying it's like when you feel that the unbearable thing, like I can't stand to be without them another moment longer. I just can't stand it. And they're like, that's when they've drawn closest to you.
Hmm.
And that I was like, I love that because that says even in the depth of when I feel that longing, right, reach out to them. They're right there. They're right there next to you.
yeah, because so many men feel that crying is a form of weakness, and it isn't. It
Mm,
isn't. Yeah, and I learned that from my dad, the Navy SEAL, who said a real man is never afraid to cry for someone he loves who's died. And the day he died, I certainly got that memo.
yeah.
And the thing is, men have to learn that expressing our emotions and crying and weeping for somebody we love is healthy. It's a healthy thing to do, and it is not weak. You know, we have hearts, we have a nervous system, we have tear ducts and feelings for a reason. And I'm very, very happy to see that you're teaching men this, Brian.
Yeah. Yeah, it's again, it's men, and it's also, again, sometimes we do it with our religion. We'll say, you know,
Yes.
you shouldn't mourn. And I learned a very valuable lesson from Mary Neal. Everybody's probably familiar with her near-death experience, but if you haven't, you know, go watch her video on YouTube. But she knew her son was going to pass. She'd been to heaven. She had seen Jesus. She had seen how everything works together, and she knew her son was going to pass away. But when her son passed over a decade again after she came back from her near-death experience, she still grieved. And again, I was like, if she can grieve knowing what she knew, then we all have the right to grieve. It's part of being human. It's something that we should go through, and that includes crying. That includes all of the emotions that come with grief. And let them flow through you. Let them go. Release them.
I could not agree more. That is healing. That's healing. You've got to let that pressure, that emotional upset out. Brian, we could talk for another 5 hours. And so I really hope that you'll be back on the show. I know that you've got the grief #2, then growth.com is your website. You got your course, Love Never Dies. And I believe you're going to be a speaker. You're going to be appearing at Helping Parents Heal this year at their annual convention in Phoenix. If people want to find out more about your podcast and your work, do they go to your website?
Yeah, go to my website. There's a couple things I do want to mention. I have a new community that I just started up recently, Mark, you're part of generously. It's a community for people that want to get this message more. It's free. So you can go to grieftogrowth.com/community, and you can apply to join that. Grieftogrowth.com/love never dies is where the course is. And the free guide we talked about is grieftogrowth.com/gems. So it's all there. Just wanted to give you those URLs.
Fantastic. So everyone, I want to thank all of you for tuning in. This was an invaluable resource and tool in healing. And that resource is personified in such an excellent form through Brian Smith. So Brian, thank you. It's been an honor having you on the show. And for everyone else out there, Dr. Pat and I, the psychic and the doc, we will be back on the clock next week. And I want to wish everyone many blessings, and may you all find the path to inner peace.
Hey everybody, thank you for tuning into The Psychic and the Doc with Mark Anthony and me, Dr. Pat Baccili, right here on TransformationTalkRadio.com. Hey look, come back next week so we can explore with you more of life's many challenges and learn from fascinating guests. And you know what? Even Mark and me. We'll connect you and discover insights from people in this life and from the afterlife. Extraordinary problems? Yeah, they do. They require extraordinary solutions. But step into the world of possibilities with us on The Psychic and the Doc. That's every Thursday, 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on TransformationTalkRadio.com. That's TransformationTalkRadio.com. And don't forget, we're also live face-to-face on Facebook.com, Transformation Talk Radio.